Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. Sven Nyholm. He is an assistant professor of philosophy and ethics at Eindhoven University of Technology in Germany. His main areas of research...
In the Netherlands.
Oh, in the Netherlands. I'm sorry. I
No
messed
problem.
it up a little bit there. Okay, so his main areas of research are applied ethics, especially the ethics of technology, ethical theory, and the history of ethics. More specifically, he has recently published on love relationships and biomedical enhancements, sex robots, motivation enhancements, accident algorithms for self-driving cars, deep brain stimulation, happiness and well-being, meaning in life, and interpersonal respect and moral reasoning. He is especially interested in how robotization and other types of automation affect traditional human values, as well as in existential questions raised by new technological developments. So Sven, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
Okay, great. So, we're going to go today through some examples of new technologies that are coming around, perhaps some technologies that are being developed, and some that are only conceptual at the moment, I guess. But before we get specifically into each of them, do you think that there are any running threads, that is, threads that run through all of these technologies that you are interested in from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, so one such thread would be that we are increasingly outsourcing human tasks, human decision making, human thinking to machines, to robots, to algorithms, to computer systems. And so one question that keeps popping up when you think about different kinds of technologies is always what does that mean for human responsibility? What does it mean for control? Can we retain what is sometimes called meaningful human control, even as we are letting cars drive us around? Algorithms decide who should get a certain kind of insurance, who is likely to reoffend, etc. Can we still retain responsibility and control over the outcomes that we want to achieve?
Mhm.
That's one such thread.
So would you say that perhaps one of your main worries is about us as humans losing agency in a way?
Yeah, so well, I actually think it raises what you might call a kind of existential question. So as we start changing the way that we interact with machines and we let them take over some tasks, it raises the question about whether is this a way of giving agency to the machines, let's say a self-driving car that's driving me to the grocery store, and let's say it's a so-called level 5 car. That would be a car that's fully automated. I only tell the car where I want to go and it takes me there. Do we have two agents here? One that's being passive, me sitting there, waiting to maybe I'm making a shopping list or something like that. And another agent, the car, who is actually doing most of the work, taking me to the grocery store. Or do we maybe have one agent, me, who is extending my agency out into this machine that I'm using so that it's a kind of extension of my agency? And I think we don't necessarily have a clear answer to this. And so it creates a kind of what you might call an existential problem, where you are bringing quasi-agents into the world, such as self-driving cars. It could be a military robot, any autonomous system, where you don't quite know yet how to think about it. Should we think of it as an agent that's separate from us? Should we think of it as an agent working together with us, maybe under our supervision? Or should we think of it as an extension of our own agency, whereby we give ourselves more powers and capabilities? I think the very concept of agency doesn't necessarily say you have to think about it one way or the other. So in a way, we have to think about what's the best way to think about human agency and machine agency. What is the way of best analyzing this that explains who is responsible, who has control, and I think that's a fairly open question.
Mm-hmm. With the example of self-driving cars, I guess, couldn't it be the case that with some of these technologies, if we maybe sacrifice some of our agency, let's say, and give them more power, if we were to get better results, if through that we were to create a better world, because we would be going over our own, let's say, intellectual limitations and the limitations of our rationality and our biases and heuristics. Do you think that we should make that trade-off? That is, trading perhaps some of our free will or agency for better results in terms of, for example, in the case of self-driving cars, reducing car crashes and deaths by car accidents and things like that. Do you think that that is something that we should consider, or that's also problematic?
No, I think that's certainly one of the key issues. And so if you look at why people say, whether it's tech companies or researchers or others, why we need or should try to develop self-driving cars, typically what they say is that, well, actually traffic is one of the biggest killers out there. People die in disproportionate numbers in traffic, or they're injured so very seriously. And so it would be really good to have some kind of alternative that would be much safer. And one great hope with the self-driving car is that it's going to give us a safer alternative so that many few people will die in traffic. Mm-hmm. And let's say the most optimistic assessments, they say something like this. Actually, 90% of all traffic deaths depend on faults committed by human drivers. So if you could just take that bad thing out of the equation, the human driver, and let them hand over control to a much safer system, then possibly we could cut as many as 90% of all accidents. I mean, there are some issues with that reasoning, because in a way you're handing over the human side to programmers, to people who have to update the cars, make sure that all cars are, communicating nicely with each other, and so on. So it doesn't seem like you can, I mean, you're not taking out the human factor, you're just moving it to another set of humans. But let's say that indeed, maybe not that quite, that goal is reach of 90% of fewer accidents, but a really substantial number of accidents can be avoided. That would certainly be a very good outcome. And as you say, it could be that we are trading that from against some amount of confusion about who exactly is responsible, who is in control. Well, if you go back to 2014 and before that, talk of accidents with self-driving cars was hypothetical for the most part. And so those of us who were doing research on this were saying, like, well, it could happen that there's a crash and we have to think about, who should be held responsible. If you then went to 2015, you had about 20 crashes with self-driving cars on public roads, experimental vehicles. Nothing really bad happened. But then fast forward to 2016, the first person is killed in a Tesla Model S operating in autopilot. In that case, Tesla said it wasn't our fault because we had a contract with our customer that they should always be in control, that they should always be responsible. We don't take responsibility. Actually, the same year, on Valentine's Day, a Google car crashed into a bus, and that was the first time that Google actually said, we take responsibility, it's in part our fault. But then in 2018, the first pedestrian was killed by a self-driving car. So this was an Uber car in Arizona. And on that occasion, there was a quick financial settlement between Uber and the family of this person who was killed. So the responsibility issue, in a way, was settled in that way. But in all of these cases, there have been discussion about who exactly should be responsible, and in all of those cases, there have been different judgment calls. So we do get this unclarity, and some people even say it would be unfair to hold humans responsible, especially the humans in the car, especially if the car is fully automated, because they're not doing anything different than another person in an automated car that doesn't crash. So you do get this unclarity and this question of who should be held responsible. But as you say, let's say that at the same time we get a huge number of fewer people dying in traffic, that might possibly be worth the trade-off. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are other areas where you might think that this trading a good outcome for confusion about responsibility could be less of a good idea. So some people say that it's okay in the case of self-driving cars, but it would not be okay in the case of autonomous military robots, sometimes called killer robots. And so why would there be a difference? So let's say that in both cases you could actually, in the military case, maybe fewer civilians would be killed. Even in the far future, when we really had advanced military robots, in the case of cars, fewer people would be killed in traffic. There are those who say that there's a relevant difference between these two cases that makes one okay and the other not. And that is that the military robot would be developed specifically as a kind of killing machine, whereas the self-driving car would kill some people as a side effect. The main aim would be to create a safer, more efficient, more fuel efficient, a greener, better kind of car. Of course, we know that in traffic, whenever heavy objects are moving fast, quickly around other heavy objects, it can't be avoided that there sometimes are going to be crashes. There could be ice on the road, there could be a sudden thunderstorm, there could be a breakdown of the technology, loss of internet connection in one car, etc. So you can't avoid crashes, but they wouldn't be specifically designed to kill people. That would be a side effect. So some would say that in one case you should take this consequentialist argument about good outcome and say that justifies handing over some control, creating some confusion, whereas in the other case of the military robot, some people say in this case, because we're creating a killing machine, we have to have clear answers to all questions about responsibility, and if we don't, or until we do, we should ban or avoid any such types of weapons systems.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and since we're already talking about self-driving cars, before moving on to the next piece of technology that we're going to explore today, let me just ask you about this, because in your work you also talk about the types of thought experiments that researchers come up with, like some types of games, for example, that they put online for people to decide using self-driving cars, some hypothetical situations, like for example putting a car in a situation where it has to decide if it will kill the driver or the people that are inside the car or some pedestrians, and then they put different situations, for example different numbers of people on each side, or for example men or women or young or old people or poor people and rich people or humans and animals, and they change all of those variants, let's say, and then people have to decide if they would prefer crashing the car and killing the driver and the people and potentially the people that are with him, or the pedestrians. And you criticize those kinds of approaches and what we could call then the trolley problem, as they call it, because it's similar to that situation with the trolley cart, where they have to decide if they want to save one person by changing its direction, or killing one person and saving five. and several different situations like that. But you say basically, as far as I understand, that those sorts of thought experiments don't really capture the entirety of the complexity of the situation, because when you are in a real car crash or eventual car crash situation, that then you have to make split-second decisions, and you're not in a calm environment when you can have a few seconds to think about it, or even a couple of minutes. And so, I mean, could you tell us about that? And maybe what are the limitations of those sorts of games and thought experiments and things like that?
Yeah, well, first of all, so people might go and check out this website called the Moral Machine website from MIT, where they can indeed, it's almost like a game, as you say. They get all these different scenarios. It's basically like a cartoon. You know, you see the self-driving car, you see maybe 3 grandmothers, and then on one side you see 3 dogs, and the question is, you know, what should the car do? And you can choose. And then you get a series of dilemmas like this, and of course the website records your answers, and it generates statistics about people's attitudes and pairs that with, you know, from what country are you, and maybe are there differences between different countries, etc. And so it's kind of entertaining, and in a way this is one of the limitations. And so when you do this experiment, it's I guess for some people it would be actually hard to take it seriously, because some of the scenarios presented are fairly comical. And so the question is whether people who are taking this quiz or this survey about attitudes, are they in the right state of mind? Are they taking this seriously? Maybe for some of the dilemmas that are presented they are, but for some of them that are the more kind of absurd ones, you would, you know, almost like start laughing when you see this little cartoon in the vignette, and you might not take it seriously. So one question is it really tracking people's attitudes when they think about this more seriously? But on the other hand, in ethical arguments, we typically want to hear people's reasoning, arguments, and why exactly do you think that the 3 grandmothers should be saved rather than the 3, I don't know, grandfathers or whatever it might be. Well, if you just have the intuition but you don't have any argument, you have a very incomplete idea how people are thinking about this. So one worry I have is that yes, this just maybe tracks certain patterns, but in ethical arguments you don't just want patterns of responses, maybe gut reactions. You also want arguments, and you want to weigh those against other arguments. And so there might be something helpful about this, but on the one hand, it might not track people's actual attitudes because they're kind of laughing at the examples and it seems too strange and comical. On the other hand, you don't get the underlying arguments. And then you may also wonder, so these are attitudes people are having about funny examples on a website. Does that really track what they think about real life and death issues involving people, perhaps their relatives, perhaps their people in their community? It's not clear that even if I take the experiment seriously, so I look at these vignettes and I try to have an attitude about that, that may be slightly different than the attitudes I would have if something happened, in my town and someone I knew was killed, etc. So you could be skeptical of what extent this actually tracks people's moral attitudes. There are plenty of reasons to be skeptical. Another would be that you're asked to just focus on this scenario and just think about what should happen in that scenario if you could decide. But of course, in real life, one person can't decide these things. There has to be a kind of societal debate. How should self-driving cars handle accident scenarios? And also, some people are going to be held responsible, or rather, society is going to be looking for people to hold responsible, perhaps to punish. And if you have one person just deciding this by clicking, yes or no, that's not how it works. And so it's fairly far away the kind of real world decision making that would go into decisions about how self-driving cars should react in accident scenarios. But all that aside, of course, I would say that this is a valuable source of information about people's attitudes. But it only goes so far, and we can't go from, okay, these are the responses that people have to the moral machine experiment, to these are the policies that we should have in our society about how self-driving cars should handle accident scenarios, who should be responsible. There has to be some fairly serious bit of argument in the middle there to take you from one the experiment results to any more normative conclusions about what should happen. So the one question is, what exactly does this tell us? Does it tell us anything? It may tell us something about people's spontaneous attitudes to a thought experiment, but does it really tell us how we should organize traffic in the future? That's more debatable.
Right. Okay, so changing subjects now, let's talk a little bit about the issue of the medicalization of love, because there are philosophers out there that think that, I guess, I will try to put it clearly, but if I make some mistake here, please correct me, that they think that if we have enough biological knowledge about how love works, then people should develop drugs and they should be available to people for them basically to control how much love they feel for another person. That is, they would be able to either increase it or decrease it. If they want to love someone more, they would enhance their love. If they want to love someone less, they would decrease their love, basically using these hypothetical drugs that researchers would develop. And it seems that there could be some issues with that. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the work about this is done by a friend of mine called Brian Earp and his colleagues such as Julian Savulescu and Anders Sandberg. All of them are associated with the UHERO Center for Practical Ethics in Oxford. So they've written a series of papers about this, and then I have a forthcoming book that I think is coming out after the summer, something like that. The American title, I think, is Love Drugs. I think in the UK the title is Love is the Drug. So it's a different title, but that's coming out sometime soon under a title along those lines, where you can sort of read about their whole research project. And what they basically are doing is that they're looking at the biology, neurochemistry of love, very much inspired by the work of people like Helen Fisher, who's an anthropologist looking at the neurochemistry of love, how love works in different societies, etc. And from that point of view, love sort of comes in different stages, and different stages have different types of biological neurochemical reactions related to them. So it starts with lust, and that might be general, so someone might want a partner but they don't really have a particular person that they have sort of homed in on yet, and then they might find someone and become attracted to them, and that creates certain changes in their hormones, neurochemicals, etc. And then after a while, if a successful relationship is achieved, then that might move to a stage called attachment, where you become attached to your partner and you want to sort of stay together with them and form kind of a relationship, possibly a family, etc. And so in all of these stages, there are different things happening in terms of hormones and neurochemicals. And so the question then arises, of course, is, okay, if we know this and we know that different types of hormones or neurochemicals are activated or deactivated during these different stages, what if we could bring this under greater control by using hormone therapy, drugs, maybe oxytocin, nasal spray, whatever it might be? Maybe that would be a good idea, because then we could control something that's hard to control, love, to a greater extent. Now, why would we want to do that? Here the question then arises, is this a good idea or not? And one type of argument that Savulescu and colleagues discuss in a lot of their work is, actually, if you look at people who are in stable romantic relationships, they tend to have pretty good improved health. They bounce back quicker if they're ill. they live longer, they're happier, and less depressed, etc. So there could be all these health benefits that would count in favor of trying to develop some sort of drugs or some sort of hormone treatments that would bring relationships under greater control. Of course, this could also go the other way. So let's say that someone is in a very unhealthy relationship where there's abuse, etc. Sometimes people are so attached to their partner that they are willing sort of to tolerate this, even though they maybe intellectually they know that this is bad for them, but they just can't bring themselves to leave that relationship. Maybe then what we should do is to use anti-love drugs to try to sort of block or deactivate some of the neurochemicals that makes them stay attached to their partner. So you could imagine it going both ways. You could use the love drugs to for all the different stages of love development. You could maybe get someone to become attracted to a person. You can maybe sustain attachment over time. In some case, you might want to deactivate the attachment. And so you could really, at least in a philosophical thought experiment, you can imagine being able to control these things. It's almost like having like an equalizer on an old school sort of stereo or something like that, when you're turning up and down different dials where you can control the hormones, the neurochemicals, to really get your relationship settings right to achieve these goals that you want to achieve, such as better health outcomes, more happiness, more pleasure, less proneness to disease, etc., depression, etc. And so that's the kind of the positive case in favor of love drugs and anti-love drugs. It really is, love is really a central human good, and what if you could control that to a greater extent? Would that not be like a good idea? Should we not explore it? So that's the one side of the issue. Mm-hmm. And so on the other side, you might ask a bunch of different questions. So some researchers would ask, should we permit this? Should this be permissible, or should we maybe forbid it? Is it right? Is it wrong? I myself have been more interested in a different kind of question. Rather than like, is this right or wrong? Is this good? Is it bad? Is this what people want when they want to find a love relationship, a partner? So let's say that we have some different possible outcomes to choose from. So let's say that it turns out that your partner, without your knowledge, has been using love enhancements. And so they tell you, I found myself unable to stay attached to you, but then I found out about love enhancements and started taking them, and now I'm able to stay in a relationship with you. I think for a lot of people, they would think, oh, okay, really, this wasn't such good news. Like, this is a little bit disappointing. I mean, maybe it's nice that there still is a relationship, but they might have hoped that actually just by being themselves, the partner would have been able to stay attached to them. Now, think about it kind of the opposite way around. Let's say that you thought that your partner was using love enhancements, but then it turned out that no, I never started taking those love enhancements. I was only thinking about it, and it wasn't needed. I could come to love you without any hormone treatments or neurochemicals activators, etc. I think a lot of people would take that as a kind of like good news. They were like, oh, I'm lovable the way I am. Just by being me, I am able to inspire this other person to love me. So that's just kind of a very intuitive thought experiment that when I teach courses on bioethics, I often kind of run this as a kind of, raise your hand if you think one thing, or raise your hand if you think another. And so a lot of people in my classes, they think, yes, the second outcome where it turns out that love enhancement was not needed somehow strikes them as more desirable. And so then the question, of course, becomes, why is that exactly? That's just a thought experiment. You can do another one, for example. Let's say that there are two people, both are using love enhancements. In one case, it's actually not needed, because even if you took away the love enhancement, the love could stay in place, so to speak. In the other case, it's really needed. And then maybe on the other extremes you have no love enhancement is used and you still have a love relationship, it's all working fine without it. And then on the very other end of the spectrum, no love enhancement is used and it can't be a love relationship because a love enhancement would be needed. So where do people want to be on this in this different four possibilities? Well, some people actually say I would prefer no love enhancement being used and no relationship to, a love enhancement is used and there is a relationship, because at least then I know that's what's authentic. Because they somehow feel that the use of a love enhancement would make the love less authentic, less true, less real. And then, so if there should be love, there should be love without love enhancement, or nothing at all. That's what some people say. So here you get more disagreement, because some people say, well, it's better to have something rather than nothing. Authenticity is nice, but that's just one value. All the goods related to love, relationships, that's another. But all of these kind of thought experiments raise the question, okay, what exactly do people want when they want love? And, well, of course, there's a long history in philosophy, going back to Plato with the Symposium, love as finding your other half. I mean, that's an expression that's, found its way into kind of everyday language. But they came, Plato had a myth in one of his dialogues where people used to have, 4 arms, 4 legs, 4 eyes, but then at some point they were divided into 2, and then love is about finding that other half of you and sort of reconnecting. That was the myth about love in the Symposium dialogue by Plato, and that's an idea that some people in a way find intuitive, that there is someone out there who's a good match for you. You can try having dates with different person, maybe trying out relationships, but some people would be a better match, other people would be a worse match. And there's something nice about this idea of finding someone who just are right for you. You match in a nice way. I mean, the Match.com used to be the most popular dating website, with this idea that there's someone out there whose personality, whose likes, whose dislikes, just match up with yours. And so some people worry that if you have to use love enhancements and you can't sustain a relationship without it, then you can't achieve this idea of finding a good match that you maybe want. And so you can look at different ideas about what people value in love, and then you can ask, if you brought a love enhancement in as a kind of necessary condition for maybe bringing about or sustaining love, would or would you not achieve those goods that you associate with love? Maybe in the case of being a good match, well, of course, I mean, this can be discussed. Maybe there's an alternative way of thinking about this, where two people are a good match, but there's something, the chemistry is missing, so to speak. Maybe then you have to bring the chemistry via an external agent. Of course, this in a way also might seem to some, well, actually I should be the agent that activates the love in my partner. So of course it all depends on what exactly do you want out of love. If you take a more instrumental view, so that you think, what I want are certain outcomes. I want good health, I want happiness, I want pleasure, I want sex, I want this, I want that. And love is a means to all those other ends. If that's my attitude, I might be quite willing to say, okay, give me a love enhancement so that I can achieve the thing that's a means to all those other ends. But of course, if you are the partner in such a relationship and someone comes to you and say, I'm interested in getting happiness, pleasure, good health outcomes, etc., I think you and a love enhancement could come together to create a means for me to achieve these ends. That person might not feel very special. They might not feel that you want them for their own sake, and they might feel that they're a means to an end. Whereas a lot of people might feel that no, actually, the idea of a love relationship, that is a kind of goal and value in itself. It's not something, of course it has all these nice side effects and benefits, But a lot of people, they actually kind of partly organize their lives around the idea of finding a relationship, sustaining a relationship. It's a goal in itself. And if that's your attitude, that may change the way you feel about the idea of a love enhancement. So it depends a little bit on whether you think of love as a goal and end in itself, something to strive for, whether you think it's a kind of a means helping you to achieve other goals.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's all very interesting, and one of the things that strikes me the most there is people caring about authenticity, because I guess that many times what they're talking about is that they want things to be spontaneous. It's not really that they want to have control over how they fall in love for another person. They just want it for it to happen, and they don't want to have any sort of control over it, and that's what they call being authentic. And that's interesting because, on the other hand, these love drugs or anti-love drugs, they would give them more, in a sense, let's say, free will or agency, because they would be able to decide when they would feel more or less love toward another person. And so it gets really complicated, because is it authentic to just follow the wisdom of your biology, let's say, because you simply feel in love for another person because of some things that happen in your brain that you really don't understand, at least in detail? Or is it authentic simply for you to have more power over what happens in your mind, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're really putting your finger on something interesting and ambiguous about love, because I do think that the way that people typically value love, there are these spontaneous elements, but there are also elements of choice and free will. One of the things, so I was talking earlier about this idea of being a good match, of kind of finding someone who you match up with. That sounds more like something spontaneous. It just happens to be the case that someone is a good match for you. But another thing that people typically value in valuing love is the idea of commitment. And so they often want to find someone who's willing to commit to them. And some people are afraid of commitment. They're not ready to take that step yet. But once they are, they may want to have a formal commitment, such as a marriage, where there's a ceremony when they're asked, do you take this person to be your, so and so beloved husband or wife, etc. In good times, bad times, for richer or poor, etc. And then the question is, do you? Yes, I do. And the other one is supposed to say also, yes, I do. And so that's a kind of a choice that's made in a very formal setting. Of course, this could be more informal. People might just start saying, oh, this is my partner, this is my girlfriend, boyfriend, or whatever, my better half, etc. But those are all, in a way, ways of publicly committing to a person. If you thought that your lover, your partner, they were obsessed, they couldn't do otherwise, or maybe they somehow they develop like this fear of not being in a relationship, and so they just feel that they have no other choice, then suddenly it starts looking like a little bit different than what we imagine when someone commits to another person. The commitment seems to be a matter of choice, where I could choose to leave my partner, and some people are happy that the partner stays because they value the fact that they're committing to them. So that seems to be whether it's a formal marriage choice made, whether it's more informal commitment, it does seem to be a kind of choice. And the person who's sort of slavishly devoted to their partner and just couldn't choose otherwise because they're obsessed with them, that seems to go beyond what people are valuing and what they want. So there is this funny mix of something spontaneous, like I can't help what I'm feeling, we're such a good match, etc. on the one hand, but on the other hand, you also want a willing commitment, a decision in favor of a partner. And then, of course, in different romantic relationships, that commitment can take different forms. One famous example is Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who actually kind of created a contract between the two of them that where they committed to each other, but it was part of the contract that could also have lovers on the side. And that was a kind of agreement that they made, and they viewed that as a kind of relationship that was suitable for them. I mean, these days there's also a lot of discussions about polyamorous types of relationships where people agree that we are going to be not just having sort of lovers on the side, but also people that we love on the side. And so the idea is that you can love more than one person, have relationships with more than one person. Of course, most people maybe think that that doesn't fit with their idea of a romantic relationship. But what all of these cases have in common is that there is a kind of agreement and a kind of commitment to a certain idea of what a relationship should be. And that all has a lot to do with agency and choice. And as you say, well, maybe a defender of love enhancement could say, well, actually, here we have something that could actually make this kind of commitment and agency, easier. You have a means of achieving this agency goals related to relationships. So that would be a kind of an argument in favor of love enhancement. Of course, again, someone might respond then that, well, if it's not enough that the person commits and that their choice is not enough, that they need to bring in an external agent, a love enhancement, then maybe the strength of their commitment seems to be pretty weak. They need something else to kind of tie them down. So it's a little bit of a matter of how you interpret this idea of commitment and what type of agency you think is required. But you're certainly right that, yeah, we have this kind of funny, that's a little bit involuntary, a little bit voluntary, and how do you kind of balance those out, in relation to each other?
Mm-hmm. So there are all of these different sorts of ways that people can think about their having more or less control over feeling love for another person and things like that. And I mean, someone could simply say that there are also a lot of products out there in the market that are somewhat problematic, but since people have the choice to use them or to consume them or not, then we would just put those drugs out there and whoever wanted could use them, and people who didn't want or didn't like them could just put them aside and something like that. But isn't there another problematic issue there when it comes to the medicalization of love? Because if you are medicalizing, in this case, a mental phenomenon, isn't it that we are saying that if people are unhappy with their relationships, then that is somewhat pathological? Because isn't that what medicalizing things is about? And isn't that problematic, that we are sort of pathologizing something that is perfectly normal in the realm of human experience, let's say?
Yeah, so this is another type of worry about medicalizing something like love, and that actually comes to a kind of a whole cluster of related worries. So one might be that we are giving too much power to the medical establishment, and maybe moreover big drug companies to start labeling relationship problems as a kind of health issues, where really it's a matter of interpersonal relationships and social issues rather than kind of a medical issue that you need to medicate. So you might put the wrong label on the problem if there is one. Some people have said, okay, so if two people find that they can't have a relationship with each other, so tough luck. That's not a medical problem. That's just a matter of being a bad match, something to be accepted. But then maybe a big pharmaceutical company says that no, you have a problem. You need to buy our very expensive product to fix this problem. Otherwise, there's something wrong with you. Yeah, so that's one sort of worry. Another would be that you take a too biological, neurochemical view of love, whereas love is really partly a kind of social practice. So maybe we should mention that when you think about love, you can really think about it in two different ways. One is the more biological, scientific way, when you ask, okay, so let's say that two people are in love or having a loving relationship, what happens to their hormones? What happens to their neurochemicals? Why would evolution generate these sort of types of capacities in people to have loving relationships? That's a kind of the more scientific, theoretical, biological view of love. But on the other hand, you can also ask, okay, so when people value love, what exactly is it that they value? What role does it play in our culture? How has it changed over time? So, for example, one development we see is that in very societies that are quite unequal in terms of men and women, the way that love or friendship was valued was maybe different than in a much more egalitarian relationship. So if you go back to discussions about friendship in the Renaissance, where men and women were quite unequal, then a lot of the things that they say about what friends, how they should relate to each other, we now say about, you know, what loving partners, how they should relate to each other. Because I mean, if you look at someone like Michel de Montaigne, who wrote beautifully about friendship, what he says about, you know, romantic relationships is it's maybe like, you and your wife are not very equal, so you can't really have that close friendship. Whereas now, most people would say, well, you and your romantic partner, of course, should be equals. Otherwise, you can't have a good relationship. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she argued specifically that actually during her the time that she lived, during the sort of the late 18th century, the fact that men and women had different rights made it almost impossible for them to have good love and friendship relationships. So unless marriage was changed into a more equal institution, you could never truly know whether your partner truly loved you, because one party might be too dominant in relation to the other in terms of rights, whereas the other one would be too subordinate in terms of rights. So something like love can also be thought of as in terms of, you know, how does it relate to other facts about society? How does it relate to our values in a much kind of social, cultural way? And one worry would be that if you start thinking about love too much in terms of enhancements and medicalization, you're forgetting that more cultural part, value-based part of love, and you're focusing way too much on the biology, the neurochemicals, which in a way is not, that's one side of it, but not the whole. Of course, you can also take the view that someone like Carrie Jenkins takes in her book, that's called, let's see, What Love Is and What Love Could Be. She says actually love is a kind of mix of those two, and so you shouldn't think that love is either something neurochemical or cultural, but it's, you know, kind of a mix of those. I mean, she doesn't think, like the love enhancement people, that we can change the neurochemicals. She focuses rather on changing cultural norms, societal, you know, ideas about what love should be, and that's the way to change love. So it's very interesting to compare someone like her work with the work of, let's say, Earp and Savulescu and Sandberg, who say, okay, so it might be quite hard to change the norms, etc., but we can change the neurochemicals, whereas she says kind of the opposite way around.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's interesting, and I guess that there's still another aspect to the medicalization of love, because if people were to develop these sorts of drugs, then people could argue, or at least the people that would be interested in using them, that then maybe it would be easier for them to have access to these drugs if they were state-funded, and so maybe medicalizing the issue and saying, oh, so this is a health problem, this is some sort of problem, it would be easier to convince the politicians and even the public in general that then is happy or unhappy with certain policies that people put forth, that the state should fund access to these drugs. Because, I mean, if it was simply a matter of enhancing or increasing a certain normal state that people would want to experience more or less of it, then then I mean people would be turned off by it, because I guess that there aren't many people that would like for the state to be funding those types of things. I mean, it would be like people asking for the state to fund their going to parties or something like that, you know. So would you also consider those types of arguments here?
Yeah, no, so that's certainly true. So, like, if you are in a society that has universal health care for everyone in that state, then yes, as a matter of fairness, maybe it would in a way be better if it was medicalized, because then, as you say, the state could help to pay for this. Of course, the question that would then arise, is this the thing we should be prioritizing? And then we have to look at, let's say that we had state-funded love enhancement available for everyone who wants it. Would that then mean that we are using up precious resources that could be used for some other program related to health? I mean, let's go back to the self-driving car. Maybe that means that you can't put money into developing, a safe infrastructure for self-driving cars, the technology. So maybe there would be more traffic deaths because you're putting all the research funding into creating love enhancements for all. So of course, on the one hand, it could be a fairness issue, so like better to have it available for everyone. But then the other thing that would, if you think about it in this sort of state-run way, would we then be using precious resources that we could? What's the opportunity cost, basically, of using our resources to give love enhancements for all? Of course, then, as you say, it might be good to actually start medicalizing something like love and ask, what are the overall health outcomes that could be produced by these different programs? Maybe the number of people living healthier, longer lives would be better in the case of love enhancement than with a safer traffic scheme. I mean, probably not, but given the actual numbers. But of course, yeah, those questions and issues would have to be weighed against each other. Of course, that you could say, sure, that's all fine, but probably people would still wish that they could have a partner where love enhancement would not be needed, but they might be happy that that is a kind of backup option for people who maybe they have children together, and they think that it would be really good for their children if they could sustain their relationship, but somehow they find they can't do it. For them, it might be really nice if they had access to state-funded love enhancements, but for the sake of their children, they might then want it. That might be quite different from a case of a couple just meeting each other and finding that they're not a good match, and then there are two options. Either they kind of maybe go off and look for other partners, or they start taking the love enhancements. I can imagine that for that couple, they might say, okay, let's just call it quits and let's see if we can find others that maybe we can remain friends, So I think it really depends a little bit on the circumstances. I could imagine that love enhancements would be much more popular among people who are already somehow committed to each other, but they can't make it work. And it's not that they think that the other person is bad. It's just something that they're not feeling it anymore, so to speak. For them, it might be a good choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that we could say that this technology wouldn't be intrinsically good or bad. It would depend mostly on what people would want or prefer, right? So let's just explore one last topic, one last question. That is, we've been talking about technology to enhance people's experience and people's relationships with one another, but another technology that is already out there and that is improving and becoming more realistic over time is sex robots. And when people talk about sex robots, they are usually thinking about the sexual side of things, but there's also the issue that as they become more and more realistic, people could also start wanting or even spontaneously forming relationships with them, right? And then love gets again into the picture, but in this case, loving a robot, right?
Yeah, so I mean, what's interesting is also that the perhaps three most well-known developers of sex robots and the three most well-known sex robots, they are all kind of pitched as being something that's about more than just sex. So there's a one that's called Roxy, spelled with three X's, where if you go to the website truecompanion.com, I mean, even in the name of the website, you can see that it's about more than sex. And you read there about Roxy, it says things such as Roxy can get to know you, get to know your likes and dislikes. She can be your loving friend, and there are, videos with the where the inventor of Roxy, who's called Douglas Hines, is interviewed, and he says, this is about more than sex. Sex is just one part of a relationship. It's also about companionship. And so there you have one example of a company specifically trying to develop a true companion. If you take the sex robot Harmony, developed by Matt McMullen, he too is trying to develop a very expressive face that would be emotionally engaging. There's a chat function where you can talk with the Harmony to develop a kind of bond. They're looking at psychological research about what makes people bond with each other, trying to implement that into the robot. There's another robot called Samantha, and that one, one of the things it's famous for is that it has very human-like skin, and it's supposed to be quite realistic. But it also has different modes that you can switch between. So there's sort of the sexy mode, but there's also the family mode. So if you sit around, around at home with, maybe your children are around, you wouldn't want your Samantha the sex robot to start, talking dirty, so to speak. You want it to be in family mode. And so there's an interview where one of the developers of this robot is saying, Samantha, she can talk about animals, about philosophy. She can even tell 1,000 different jokes. And so you can really have a discussion with Samantha. And again, the idea is that these are robots developed to be more like a partner, a friend, in addition, of course, a friend with benefits, if you will. So there's sex, but there's also the companionship. So on the one hand, you have companies trying to develop that. There may also be a market. Of course, people who do empirical research about this, they sometimes have trouble finding people who are willing to be surveyed about their preferences. Are you a sex robot buyer, sex doll buyer? Do you want to have a relationship with a sex doll? People may feel that that's too private. They don't want to share that. They don't know what's going to happen with the answers that they give to these questions. So it can be hard to know how big the market is for these kind of companion partners, robots / sex robots. But I mean, there are some people who sometimes appear in the media to talk about these kinds of things. There's a guy living in Michigan who calls himself Dave Cat. He's been interviewed in, by the BBC. He's been in the Atlantic and lots of different places. And I mean, he doesn't have a sex robot. He has a sex doll, and about which he says that he's been married to that sex doll for 15 years. And they're really, he says in one interview that, I would never think of treating her, the sex doll, as a mere object. It's a person. And, so, he's not alone. There are others who also have what they regard as relationships with dolls. So if people are willing to have relationships with sex dolls or dolls, then for sure it would be quite possible to imagine that people would have even more interest in having relationships with a robot because they can actually talk with them and interact in a more active way. So it's quite likely that not only are the companies trying to invent these robots, but there are some people who would want to have relationships with them. Again, of course, it's a little bit like with the love enhancement case. Again, you can ask, okay, let's say that we could have these robot relationships. Would they give people what they want when they value love, or would it be perhaps something good, but not quite the same thing? Mm-hmm. That's a question that one would want to kind of explore.
But for both cases, would you consider a valid argument just to say that if we are to commercialize these drugs or these sex robots, then since we would not be forcing people to buy them or to use them or to establish any sort of relationship with them, then that would be a legitimate thing to do, because we wouldn't be forcing people to do anything with them?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a pretty powerful feminist critique of sex robots as love partners. For example, Kathleen Richardson, she has published a number of papers, and I believe that she's coming out with a book sometime later this year, where she argues that actually, if you look at a lot of sex robots, they seem to be modeled on sort of a pornographic idea of what a woman should look like, how they should behave. And so the worry is that they will come to kind of symbolize a distorted idea of what a partner should be like, and that maybe they would strengthen bad stereotypes and make people become more set in a kind of mindset where they think about also human partners on the model of these, extremely pornography-like sex dolls. Of course, so they would come to symbolize a kind of relationship that would not be a healthy one, would not be an equal one, would objectify sex partners, maybe in particular women. Of course, I mean, there's also a sex robot called Henry, who's the kind of the male version of Harmony. So there are also male sex robots, but of course the most well-known ones are the ones that look like females. So the question would be, would this symbolize something bad? Of course, a question then arises that actually if you made a sex robot that looked like, a porn star, but looked like a normal person, and then maybe whose personality attributes were not like that of a very stereotypical porn star, but a normal person, then maybe it could come to symbolize something good. And maybe for people who are not good at interacting with humans, maybe they can practice. First have a relationship with a robot, and the robot could maybe coach them. They could teach them about human anatomy. They could teach them about how to treat a partner nicely, how to respect consent, etc. So maybe they could be used as a kind of training, tool that would take you in the direction of becoming a more accomplished human partner. That would be a response to this kind of a feminist critique, and that also some people like Neil MacArthur and others have defended in their articles about this. It has something in common with a kind of robot that is used experimentally in the treatment of autistic children. So there is a robot called Casper, and the idea is that for some autistic children who have a lot of difficulty kind of interacting with strangers, like if a stranger that they haven't met before enters the room, they just look away. You can't contact them. But it's been found that with a robot that looks like a kind of simplified version of a human, there's a face, but it's very simplified. There are facial expressions, but they're not very dynamic, etc. For some of these children, they kind of open up. They become willing to interact with this robot, and some of them even turn to the human experimenter and point to the robot so that there's sort of shared attention towards the robot, and that's already a connection that the child might not have made before. So the idea there is that by interacting with the robot, the child gets training in how to interact with other people and become an improved person, able to be engaged in maybe better social interaction. That's the model that some people say, well, we can apply the same idea to the case of the sex robot. Maybe people who have some problems with relationships, maybe they could train together with a sex robot. the response in both cases is that, well, what if people want to just stay with the robot? Even the people who are, so I saw a presentation by Ben Robbins, who's one of the developers of this autism robot. He was saying, like, one of the worries that we have is that the children would just say, well, I prefer the robot. Why would I want to sort of graduate to go on to be with a human, person interacting with the human? Maybe some people would say, you know, I have my sex robot, I have my, virtual girlfriend, I have my imaginary. I control all the settings. I decide everything. I don't have to adjust to another person. Real people are so complicated. I prefer my pre-programmed adjustable sex robot partner. So that would be the worry, that people wouldn't actually then want, well, some subset of people would just say, okay, this is all I need. I don't want to be with complicated other human beings. Some people see that as a kind of worrying possible development, that people would lose a lot of their social skills, at least some group of people, and would just kind of home in on these robots. Mm-hmm. So those are two different perspectives on in possible developments.
Okay, so this will be my final question.
Yep.
Just focusing just on the dark side of interactions with sex robots, and let's say that perhaps some people would treat them violently and some people would use them in the sense that we perhaps could consider sexual violence or even rape. Those arguments put forth by some feminists, at the end of the day, they are empirical questions, right? That is, the effects that would have on people, and if they would treat real people the same way. Because I remember perfectly that for the last few decades, people have been worrying about the effects that exposing particularly children to violent video games and violent movies and adolescents to pornography and things like that, that those things would predispose them to be more violent and to commit some sort of crime, or even in the case of pornography, it would increase rape and sexual violence. But in fact, when we look at the studies, that doesn't happen, and it seems that even just by a way of correlation, it doesn't imply causation, but if we track the increase in consumption of pornography, the rates of violence and crime have been going down, even when it comes to sexual crime. So, at the end of the day, those are empirical questions, right?
Yeah, so I have a friend of mine, Irish philosopher and lawyer, John Danaher. He looked at a lot of that literature on both video games, pornography, but also what kind of research could be done about sex robots. And his reading of the literature is that there's a lot of disagreement. The people who kind of have decided beforehand that they want the research to show that this causes violence and rape, etc., they tend to may sometimes interpret the research as showing that. Some people who are very much preset on getting to the conclusion that it doesn't show this at all, they interpret the data differently. People who are more nuanced, they say that actually the data is very hard to read. It's very hard to do controlled experiments because there are so many different factors. And as you say, there may be correlation, but that doesn't imply causation. And it could be that people who are already interested in violence, they would gravitate towards violent pornography, violent video games. And so, it could be that there's a great correlation between people who are interested in violence and video games, etc. But that could be because they have a pre-existing interest in this. So one doesn't know what causes what. Now, the same could be true in the case of sex robots. People who are interested in sexual violence might want a sex robot against which they could engage in sexual violence. So the question would be then, is there some other kind of harm, maybe a symbolic type of harm? So let's say that a government permitted the sale of what you might call a kind of rape robot or child rape robots. In a way, the government would not say, under all circumstances, we are opposed to this. This is taboo in our society. There can't sale of anything that would kind of glamorize say it's okay or have any other kind of a positive attitude. Symbolically, the society might want to say, even if it's a robot and we don't believe that a robot is a human being, it can't be harmed, etc. Nevertheless, we take a kind of symbolic stance against this. And so someone might say, like, if a country permitted it, they wouldn't take that. They would say, okay, on some level, it's up to you. So it depends a little bit on how you think in terms of, are the only kind of harms that can be committed sort of actual physical causal harms, where, if I hit someone, there will be a mark on their body and there will be pain that you can locate. It's very causal, it's very physical, but could there also be a kind of symbolic harm? If I insult someone, of course they might feel psychological pain and become depressed, but it could also be that you think someone is pretty thick-skinned and so they don't actually suffer a lot of psychological trauma, but nevertheless they can be harmed because it's not respecting them as a person to say this insult. So it all depends a little bit on what do you think? How do you think of different kinds of harms and moral wrongs? And perhaps some of the robots that would look like children, or that would be kind of a rape robot, fantasy robot, that could be a kind of symbolic harm, even if it didn't actually lead to more rape or more child rape or whatever. So again, I would recommend some of the work by John Danaher. He was written very interestingly about this, both in terms of this connection between pornography and video games, but also in relation to pedophilia and child pornography. So I would recommend people to check out his work on this.
Okay, Sven, so just before we go, would you like to tell people what are the best places on the internet for them to find your work? And earlier you also referred to a new book that you have coming out soon, right? Could you tell us about that again?
Yeah, so well, the best place to find out about my work would actually be to look at my Twitter account, because typically when if I publish a paper or if I appear in a video like this or something like that, I would typically put up a link there. I also have, there's also these academic social media websites such as academia.edu, ResearchGate, etc. But those are, you have to be a member, and so Twitter, I guess, would be the best place to look at. And I do have a book I'm working on at the moment. So the working title is Humans, Robots, and Ethics. That's subject to change, but it's basically about all of these topics that we have been discussing today, the ethics of how humans should behave around robots and of how robots should be made to behave around humans. And I'm especially interested in that in relation to the fact that we tend to anthropomorphize robots. We tend to attribute agency to them. And so one question is, how much agency do they really have? And are we making a mistake when we anthropomorphize them, when we treat them as humans, and what should we do about these human tendencies? And so that, it's scheduled to come out in I think March of 2020. I'm supposed to deliver my manuscript in October of this year, so I'm actually hard at work working on this book at the moment, and so hopefully that will come out next year.
Okay, great. So Sven, it was really a pleasure again to have you on the show. It was a really fascinating conversation, and let me leave you right now a new invitation to come on the show when your book is out. So,
sure thing. Thank you very much.
Hi there, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, I also have a PayPal and Subscribestar. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, and Dr. Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, and Rutger Voss, and also my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.